Too often, I have been told by historians that they have an understanding of the Invalid Corps because they read the chapter on the Invalid Corps and Veteran Reserve Corps from the War of the Rebellion book series. The books themselves are a collection of reports gathered by the U.S. War Department. The purpose of these volumes were to preserve, organize, and publish official battlefield reports, correspondence, orders, and returns of the American Civil War. The problem is, I have a number of reports, letters, and newspapers in my collection that conflict with the War of the Rebellion's report on the Corps. Right off, it should be addressed that the War of the Rebellion report is through September 30th, 1865. The majority of officers and soldiers had not been authorized to be mustered out. That happened almost a month later, on October 26, 1865, via General Order 155. So the majority of the men that lived through the time of the Invalid Corps and Veteran Reserve Corps were still enlisted and should have been used for reference. With that, I will show items from my collection to explain my thoughts. One of the opening lines of the War of the Rebellion report states, "To conscript or enlist infirm citizens would have been cruelty and folly, except under the extremest pressure of necessity." The problem with this statement is disabled citizens were already protected from enlistment and the draft, as shown here in my exemption passes. The report goes on to say the intention of the Invalid Corps was to keep in service experienced soldiers who were simply disabled. Yet 3 more pages into the report, the writer claims some soldiers are so severely injured and other soldiers have severest and most hopeless cases of disability. Under the title Introductory Measures, the writer talks about the first steps in establishing a corps, but describes General Order 69 and the medical department's invalid detachments. Invalid detachments and the Invalid Corps were not the same. In fact, when the Invalid Corps started, the Invalid detachments were revoked instead of simply being transferred to the Invalid Corps. The writer goes on to talk about the purpose of the Corps, stating the Corps was to provide the government with a reliable military police urgently needed in times of raids, riots, and treason. This was not the purpose of the invalid detachments, as they were to be an extra set of hands to medical personnel, and this was not explained in the original authorization of the Invalid Corps. General Order 105, 130, and 173 all relate to the original structure of the Invalid Corps, but leave out the Corps' purpose. This wasn't explained until General Order 212. Under the chapter title Establishment and Nature of the Bureau, it addresses Richard Rush as the first officer assigned to the Invalid Corps. If you have watched my previous videos, you would have seen my video on Richard Rush and the Invalid Corps. It is addressed correctly that Richard Rush was assigned to the Invalid Corps and not enlisted. Where I find a problem is when the report states Richard Rush held that position until November 9th, 1863, yet I have his name on reports dated February 15th, 1864. The report goes further into placement of officers by stating these last officers were permitted to transfer their services to the Corps on proper proof of physical disability. The problem here is no officer was transferred. All officers had to apply for a position in the Invalid Corps. If they successfully passed their application, they would receive a letter addressing their appointment for the Invalid Corps. If successful, they would be enlisted. An early idea with the Invalid Corps was to separate the soldiers by disability and group them by battalions. Often overlooked is the 3rd Battalion. The 3rd Battalion failed due to the lack of soldiers' disabilities to qualify them for the 3rd Battalion. The War of the Rebellion report states the severest and most hopeless of cases of disability were assigned to the 3rd Battalion. Although this is mentioned in other reports, the general rule was men of the 3rd Battalion were missing a foot or leg, as shown in this letter written by a civilian out of New York and in the Army-Navy Official Gazette newspaper. Statements in the War of the Rebellion report that really bother me are the statements they might be mustered out and re-enlisted in the Corps if they choose, and if they were mustered out for disability at their own request. Entering the Invalid Corps was generally not a choice. In fact, examiners were forbidden to discharge soldiers due to disabilities. The placement of each injured or disabled enlisted soldier depended on the master examining surgeon. Many soldiers wrote home complaining about this, feeling they had a choice when in fact they did not. David Knowles wrote, "You wanted to know the reason I could not go back to the regiment. I will tell you the reason why. The doctors examined me and they said I was not fit for field duty, and they put me in the Invalid Corps." Private Whitman wrote, "Last Monday evening the ward surgeon came in to examine every man, and all who were not fit for the regiment were to be in the Invalid Corps. He asked me which battalion I chose to go in. I replied, neither. He said, 'Where do you propose to go?' I told him I wanted my discharge and to go home, for this disease had been running on me long enough, and I wanted to get cured. He replied that the surgeon in charge would not discharge me, for he had refused just such cases before." As the War of the Rebellion report was reviewing the battalion placement, it states that those of the 2nd who became entirely disabled might be discharged, except in the cases of good men injured in the service who desire to remain. In a letter written by Alan Lovejoy while in Lavelle General Hospital, he wrote, "There is a man in this ward now who has been sick all the time since last December and been examined for a discharge 4 times, and he will not get one now, perhaps this summer. He had typhoid fever, then pneumonia, and now sick again. So you see how it is here about a discharge. If a man can crawl, he is put in the Invalid Corps, and if he can't crawl, he is kept here for the green doctors to practice their skill on." After the Invalid Corps changed their name to the Veteran Reserve Corps, the War of the Rebellion talks of the work and duties of the Veteran Reserve Corps. It states, "It is believed that more duty would not have been demanded of a similar number of able-bodied soldiers." The 1864 American Annual Cyclopedia states, "The entire Corps is doing the duty which otherwise would have been performed by an equal number of able-bodied troops." These two sources state the men who should be doing less are still doing the same amount of labor, while the Army-Navy Journal newspaper of April 1864, talking about the Invalid Corps' future, states, "The amount of duty it now performs is heavy, even for the ablest men." Seems to me there's more than a few discrepancies between the War of the Rebellion review and the men who actually served in the Corps. So, who was the man entrusted with writing the military's review on the Invalid Corps and Veteran Reserve Corps? It was Captain J. W. DeForest. Now, with over 500 Invalid officers available, why was he chosen? Well, I in fact do not know, but I believe it was because he was in the Veteran Reserve Corps and a credited author before enlisting into the service. He had a number of published books in circulation before signing into the war and continued to write during the war. The problem I have with Captain DeForest being chose to lock in this Corps' history is the timing. Captain DeForest was only in the Corps for 2 months before the war's end. Although he enlisted in the service October of 1861, he only had 2 months with the Corps during their time in the actual conflict. There were many other invalid officers enlisted and that had been in the Corps from the beginning, but a man with little hands-on knowledge of the Corps was the one chosen to tell that Corps story. This is why when someone bases their entire knowledge of the Invalid Corps and Veteran Reserve Corps on the War of the Rebellion, I want to sit down with them and let them know the stories and duties these men detail with their own writings.